This episode of Bullet Heaven was made with a copy of the game provided by Zerodiv. In episode 202 of Bullet Heaven, we figured that Zerodiv's next shmup release for the Switch would be the follow-up to Samurai Aces, called Sengoku Blade, otherwise known as Tengai in the West. We were wrong, but not by especially much. In the end, we got a totally different Psycho side-scroller in the form of the dubious Soul Divide, Sword of Darkness. This one has quite the reputation preceding it though, as evidenced by the many oh no Soul Divides during our livestream.
Soul Divide, Sword of Darkness for Nintendo Switch was released to the Nintendo eShop on March 22, 2018. Originally released to arcades in 1997, it is one of the few Psycho games to be produced in a horizontal, or Yoko fashion. Soul Divide would see release to many consoles worldwide, including a North American PS1 release from XS Games, and PS2 releases in Europe. A Sega Saturn version also exists from Japan. But could this game really be as bad as people think? Let's take a closer look.
Soul Divide takes a lot of liberties as a shmup and morphs into something that ends up being kind of weak on all fronts. It has bullets to shoot and dodge, but also some brawling elements to them. It's like a beat-em shmup. Yeah, I made that up. Coined and minted, TMNC. Starting off, players have their choice of one of three characters with unique ranged, physical, and magic attacks. So let's talk controls, because this game is a little odd in all respects. Sometimes for the better, but, well, you'll see.
Players have their typical 8-way movement to get around the screen. You know the drill by now. Joy-Con analogs beat directional buttons, Pro Controller and SN30 D-pads beat Joy-Cons. The player's movement is pretty nimble, all things considered, but everything is also really, really big, making things pretty claustrophobic. Thankfully, simply colliding with enemies doesn't hurt the player. However, there's no definition to the player's huge hitbox. It is smaller than the player's sprite, but large enough that getting hit by melee attacks and bullets will happen frequently. Because of this, players will always have a hard time feeling out where those attacks will pass a player by.
Players aren't totally defenseless though. The player has three main attacks at their disposal. First up is a long-range shooting attack that is fired rapidly with the A button, or tapped with Y, or their equivalents on a Switch Joy-Con or compatible controller. The player's firepower can be increased by collecting grimoires emblazoned with a P to a maximum level of 3. Outside of popcorn enemies, the player's main shots feel incredibly weak versus the majority of the game's opposition. A lot of time will be spent chipping away at most foes while they continuously charge in and fire bullets at the player. This is where the melee attack comes in, which is executed with the B button. The melee attack is quite powerful but considerably slow, and it requires the player to get really close to their enemies to really make use of it. But there are even combo attacks unique to each character that can be executed to deal a good amount of damage in a short amount of time.
The things that bring both of these attacks together are the player's magic attacks, which are activated with the X button or its equivalent. There are a healthy number of magic scrolls that will be dropped by defeated enemies, which become available for use when picked up. These spells can be selected with the L and R buttons or their equivalents. Each will require a certain amount of magic power to activate, which is drawn from the player's magic gauge, shown in purple. Any spell that can be used will be shown in color, while unusable spells are grayed out. However, the power required for a specific spell will also show below the gauge, giving players a visual indication of how much magic power will remain after use.
With so many different effects, players have a lot of choice when it comes to supporting their offensive abilities with these spells. Some do quite a bit of damage, while others will stop enemies for a certain amount of time, allowing for a consequence-free physical beatdown. Especially in the case of bosses, players can do enormous damage with the right spells at their disposal. Some spells even cancel out bullets, so timing these specific spells to deal with larger, faster bullet barrages can definitely assist in making it through the game as unscathed as possible. Players can restore their magic power with red bottles that are dropped by enemies. Using an ability and immediately collecting a bottle can be a great strategy for making effective progress mid-stage.
It gets pretty frustrating most times though. Players can't attack when they're hit, and it seems, more or less, that the player's character is getting wailed on almost constantly, which is a complete pain in the butt. This would be a pretty big problem if Soul Divide had a typical life stock, but unlike many other Japanese side-scrolling shooters, players have a life bar instead. This life bar can be refilled with life recovery vials dropped from certain enemies. A player's maximum life will increase with the collection of max life items, increasing the life gauge by a millimeter or two in length with each one collected.
Soul Divide is played over the course of 6 stages. There's a small amount of non-linearity as players go through the first few stages, but unlike other Psycho games, they are not random. Instead, players can choose which stages they want to take on at specific points. However, the first 4 stages are insanely short. The 5th and 6th stages are somewhat more lengthy, multi-phase affairs that raise the difficulty considerably. By default, players have 2 extra credits to see their game through to the end. If the player chooses to continue, they can continue right where they left off during the first 4 stages. But after the 4th stage, players must rely on their skill, as continuing will force them all the way back to stage start, rather than continuing immediately after death. A lengthy and difficult recover, for sure.
Soul Divide has a story that's fairly light on substance, but playing with a friend adds extra bits to the plot through unique interactions between player characters. There are a total of 6 different arcs depending on what characters are chosen and whether the game is being played solo or not. At the very least, it adds replay value to the game as a whole. Additionally, each player has their own pool of credits, which is uncharacteristic but welcome. Co-op allows players more flexibility when continuing in later stages as well, since the game will continue as long as a player is still in the game.
But all in all, is Soul Divide any fun? Well, it isn't 100% awful. We did enjoy some key features, but it's definitely rough around all of its edges. The spell system is neat, and players can certainly get used to enemy attack patterns and timing given enough time with the game. But a lack of a clearly defined hitbox, crowded short stages, cheap enemy attacks, clunky melee mechanics, there's not much incentive to going back to Soul Divide once all of the endings are viewed. A fairly frustrating 1cc is probably possible here too, so if players are looking to strike this one off the list, well, here it is.
Soul Divide features 4 difficulty levels with comparatively low challenge rates compared to other Psycho games, but that's relative given the busted nature of the mechanics. There was another questionable choice in this particular release as well. The player's score and, by extension, multiplier indicators are hidden by default and have to be enabled to be seen. A minor issue, but still questionable nonetheless. As is the case with most games, though, Soul Divide is sure to have its fans, but for us, and many others, Soul Divide isn't exactly approachable or, well executed.
Like many other Psycho games, the scoring in Soul Divide isn't especially deep. Mostly, players will achieve their scores from enemy destruction, but there's a little more to the scores that players receive in this manner.
If players can chain enemy kills with melee combo attacks, a multiplier will be applied to the kill, to a maximum of 4 times. This can also apply to bosses as well, leading to some pretty sizable scores.
As with a lot of other shmups out there, collecting power-up items past maximum power or spellbooks when the spell has already been obtained will lead to a multi-thousand point bonus to boost the player's score. In this case, also collecting life power-ups past maximum life will also grant a bonus. Of course, if a player continues, the score is wiped.
Once again, as with other Zerodiv games, there are no online leaderboards in Soul Divide, leaving players to hit that screen capture button on the left Joy-Con and uploading score to social media and the like.
The scoring in Soul Divide could boost the replay of the game ever so slightly, so it may well be worth a look for people looking to compete in a difficult by accident shooting game. Right, so Soul Divide has kind of an ugly presentation, there's just no way around it. I could sugarcoat this section by saying that it was a time of early pre-renders and stuff, but damn it, the sprite-based games of the time just looked better. It does have a couple of redeeming factors though.
As we said before, the story is pretty straightforward. Typical Save the World fare with all of the evil arch nemesis, summoning rituals, and final boss turned god scenarios as you'd expect from a fantasy-based game. Again, with alternate story interactions depending on what character players choose and whether they play solo or co-op, multiple playthroughs will be needed to see them all. The translation is definitely a little wonky in places with some pretty awkward interactions, but it still manages to get the job done.
Visually, all of the characters here are kind of janky with a moderate level of detail, even with their huge size. Especially since the game is displayed with large chunky pixels, they very clearly haven't aged especially well. It's a good thing, then, that the large bosses look much better by comparison to the smaller enemies and player sprites. But they are still very simple with some chunky animation. Even the character portraits aren't really much to write home about.
Some of the backdrops in Soul Divide are actually pretty cool, especially where animated clouds and smoke are present, but others leave a lot to be desired. They aren't horrendous, but we've seen much better scenery from much earlier games. Again, with the kinds of hard pixels used here, they don't hold up very well, even with filters applied. There's also a fair amount of stippling in the renders, which makes things look very dated. But yeah, in the end, the visuals could really have been much, much better.
Sound-wise though, Soul Divide is actually pretty good. It has all the right moody pieces and cheesy victory jingles that make the flimsy story work. The actual stage BGM and boss themes are pretty well composed too, but some of the stages are too short and cut the music off just as they're getting to the best parts. Some other pieces are a little iffy on the composition, but otherwise work fairly well.
The sound effects are also well produced and work well for their applied use. Soul Divide's voice clips are also nice and bright, even if they are more or less typical fare. In the end, Soul Divide's sound is the strongest part of the whole game, which actually makes the game much more tolerable to us. Others may not think so.
Rounding out the presentation are a number of meta options to rebalance the sound effects and music, add or remove screen filters, toggle between 4:3 and 16:9 aspect ratios, as well as changing the text from a modern high-res font to a classic pixelized one.
So, how does Soul Divide stack up? Let's take a look.
Moving your character about the screen is fine, but when it comes to melee attacks, ugh.
It'll take a while to get used to things, maybe a long while, maybe never, but at least some progress can be made with a lot of patience.
Soul Divide isn't really especially challenging, or at least it shouldn't be. Most of its difficulty comes from its jank gameplay.
Soul Divide is an incredibly frustrating time, which is mitigated by certain stronger creative aspects.
With 6 main stages, only 2 of which are of sufficient length, Soul Divide feels like it was shortened to keep players from having to deal with more of its many issues.
Soul Divide is a very, very short game. The first 4 stages are incredibly brief, while 5 and 6 are much longer, but only by comparison.
Soul Divide's pre-rendered visuals haven't aged especially gracefully. Some sprites work okay, others not so much.
The bosses by comparison look pretty good, but have choppy animation to them.
The strongest part of Soul Divide, its audio has a number of great standouts, cheesy pieces, and good effects that all come together well for their applied use.
Some of the stages are too short for some of the best pieces to hit their stride though.
Soul Divide has a lot of great ideas that don't exactly work well the way they've been implemented. The melee combat is way too clunky, and the shooting aspects are way too weak.
The spell system is great though. If it could all be refined and the hitbox better defined, Soul Divide might be able to be salvaged after all this time. But could it be? Or should it?
As with all other Zerodiv Shmup releases, Soul Divide is only about $8, meaning players can still give it a go for themselves for less than the cost of dinner. Well, not craft dinner, but you get what we're saying.
At the very least, it still has its moments, especially the final boss. That, at least, makes for a good conversation piece, especially for so little money.
Soul Divide has a pretty rotten reputation, and we can kinda see why, when it's not frustrating players with its super cheap melee system and constant close-range pot shots wearing down the player. It can still be a good time every now and again, but on the whole, this rare misstep is for Psycho completionists only. Soul Divide, Sword of Darkness for Nintendo Switch, gets a 2.75 out of 5. $8 isn't so bad though. If you want to check out Soul Divide for yourself, you can grab a copy from the Nintendo eShop today. Well, that was a thing. Good news though, it turns out Tengai was actually released, and from what I've checked out so far, it's way better than Soul Divide.
I'm sure anything is better than Soul Divide. Even Samurai Aces was better than Soul Divide.
Yeah, this seems like a pretty big misstep from Psycho. But I heard that Dragon Blaze is also coming soon.
That one actually looks pretty cool. Bring it on.
Yee, bring it on.